Hey there, today I'm going to be attempting to lift this '02 VW Golf TDI approximately 2 inches. Now, I'm not going to be using any mass-produced lift kits of any kind, but rather using nothing but different springs and other things that you can find at your local auto parts store, and maybe hardware store as well. To be clear, this homebrew lift kit is intended to be used on TDI-equipped MK4 Golfs and Jettas. This may work with the 1.8 gas models, but modifications may be needed for the VR6 models due to the engine's heavier weight. I recommend doing your own research when it comes to those two models. Now, let's get started. So this here is what I've got. We've got Moog springs front and rear. These are the springs you're going to want to get to make this lift happen. Now these front springs, part number 81134, are for the VR6 Golf and should provide about a ½ inch of lift, while these rear springs, part number 81055, are for a Jetta wagon and should provide about 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches of lift. So to pair up with those front springs, I've heard that spacers can be added. So this is what I came up with, as a 3/4 inch black iron coupling. Now I've read on various forums about using a 1-inch metal pipe, but I found this and thought, it'll work. It has a 3/4 inch inner diameter, but the outer diameter is 1 inch, so it's a nice thick 1/4 inch wall thickness. Oh, and it's also 1.5 inches in length, so it should give an extra 1.5 inches of lift on top of this 1/2 inch coil spring right here. Now these shocks and struts you see here are optional only. There are factory OEM spec parts for the TDI Golf and do not provide any benefit to the lift. I'm just replacing mine because I'm still rolling on the factory installed suspension with 235,000 miles on it, so it's long overdue to be replaced. So with the car jacked up and the wheel off, let's go ahead and start taking off this bolt right here, which goes all the way through and clamps the knuckle to the strut. Let's loosen that and take that out. Alright, with that bolt out, let's now move on to the sway bar. So let's take this bolt out. So with those two bolts out, you can now see that this is a sort of like a clamp. It's clamped together by that one bolt we took out first. So we need to put something in between here, like a wedge, and pry this apart so we can slide this strut out. I had better luck with the driver's side, but this passenger side was fighting me the whole way. You'll see why in the next clip. However, with enough prying and hammering, the strut should slide out of the knuckle. Alright, so as just a little bit of an update, I found out that the drive shaft here was hitting or bottoming out on this bracket right here. So I wasn't able to get this knuckle down far enough in order to slide this thing out. So I had to undo the control arms. Both bolts of the control arms, pull that out a little bit, give this a bit more clearance in order to drop down low enough for this to slide out. Moving on to the top of the strut. So now we got this up here, which as you can see takes a hex or an Allen wrench, 7mm. So that fits in there just like that. But you also have a nut right here. So what I've done is I put the 21mm nut or socket right there. Ah, crap, you kidding me? Yep, thanks to the brilliance of German engineering, we can't take this strut off with the common peasant tools that the average backyard mechanic would have. Instead, it requires the use of a pass-through socket set, which I obviously didn't have. So instead of going into town and getting the proper tools to do the job, well, I did what I do best, and I MacGyvered a way to get the nut off. Basically, I stuck that 21mm socket on, found a flathead screwdriver that fit inside the hex bolt within, and leveraged each one with a set of pliers. And hey, it worked. But seriously, don't be like me, kids. Get the right tools for the job. Alright, so now that the strut's out, we can go ahead and hook up these strut compressors. Alright, so now
with that spring compressed, we can now take off that nut right there.
Which, once again, requires the use of a pass-through socket. But, just like last time, I was able to MacGyver the nut off, and much easier than the last one I might add. No ooga-doogas required.
There we go. Now the spring will come out. Got the boot and a little bushing, which actually still look to be in pretty good condition, but I'm replacing that anyway. Turns out both of these struts were completely shot. Look at that. You just push them right down and they stay down. So now that I have the spring out of that passenger side, you now get a comparison of the two springs that we have here. So this is the one that just came out. As you can see, not as many coils per inch. I don't know how you want to describe it. There's not enough coils per entire length. How about that? There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. This one, the new one, which is designed for the BR6 engines, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 2 more coils. It's also significantly heavier. Not so much thicker, but definitely heavier and well, beefier looking, really. So as far as height goes, I don't really see much of a difference. If anything, the new one might be slightly taller, but it's not much. So let's go ahead and throw this thing in. Alright, so the first thing that's going on this new strut, new boot kit. So got that and that. Then we got the spring itself. Okay, so we got that in. Now we gotta compress the hell out of it. That's about as much as my drill's gonna be able to do. I think the battery's almost dead.
Unfortunately, my camera failed to record the rest of the strut assembly process, but basically, you'll want to continue compressing the spring until it's possible to fit the spring plate, makeshift spacer, strut bearing, and strut mount on top of the spring in this exact order, with enough threads poking through from the strut to start the strut bearing nut. From there, tighten the nut and torque to 44 foot-pounds. We can now start installing our modified strut assembly back onto the car. Now, if you've made it this far, I'm pretty sure you can figure it out from here, as it's literally the same as taking the strut out, just reversed. One bit of advice I can give, however, is that I found it extremely helpful to pry that opening in the knuckle apart with a chisel just a little bit to get that bottom of the strut to slide in a little bit easier. And of course, don't forget to torque all the bolts. 44 pounds for the top strut nut, 44 pounds for the bottom strut bolt, 33 pounds for the sway bar link bolt, and if you disconnected the control arm, those 2 bolts are 52 pounds. With the front end all buttoned up, we can now move on to the rear suspension. Alright, so for the rear, it should be pretty simple, a hell of a lot simpler than the front. What I'm guessing is, obviously the shock is going to have to come out. Got to replace it anyway. Spring. Once we drop the shock, the whole rear axle assembly should be able to just drop down. Pop this guy out, put the new spring in, which is taller. It said that the rear spring, the wagon springs, are approximately 1.5 to 2 inches taller than this stock one. So that should provide us with all the lift we need. We no need to put spacers in or anything like that. So let's get started. Alright, so after I've disconnected this shock absorber, I've noticed that this still isn't going down far enough to actually get the spring out, so I think I'm going to have to disconnect the shock absorber on the other side as well and let that side drop. And then hopefully this will be able to drop much lower and get everything out. Alright, with that shock absorber out, you can see that this thing is dropped considerably lower. Now, we can now pop this guy out. There we go.
So just like the front coils, here's a comparison of the new coils and the old coils. As you can see, way more coil spirally things compared to the front one or the old one. So we got like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah, let's call it 6 coils on the old one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 coils on the new one. Lengthwise, they look pretty much the same. But again, you know, these are made for the I think the V6 wagons, and so it's, you know, made to carry a lot more weight. So that, I think, would mean that it's not going to compress as much when it's back there, and in theory keep it raised up a little bit more than these old springs. So in addition to new springs, of course, I got new shocks. This is the original shocks that came with this vehicle. You can see here date stamp of 18-4-02, so 2002, made in Germany. Needless to say, this shock is well used. Now this new shock that I got is a Gabriel Guardian part number 81934. Now the reason why I got this shock is because after looking at all the other shocks off of Rock Auto, which is where I got all these parts, this one seemed to have the longest extended length. Now if you compare, I got the holes lined up on the bottom. This one is slightly longer, maybe like 1/4 to 1/2 inch longer than the stock OEM shock. So I think that will definitely help, considering, you know, obviously I'm putting a lift kit on this, but want a longer shock. Now I've seen forums where they put a spacer where the top mounts, you know, the top of the shock mounts to the body. I don't think I'm going to do that because, I mean, after jacking up this vehicle and seeing how far down the wheels droop, I don't think it's going to be necessary to put any spacers on the shocks. I think it's going to have plenty of travel to get the job done. So we'll see how this works, just putting just a straight shock on there, no spacers, and yeah, so let's get going on that. Alright, with the top of the shock absorber bolted in, we can now shimmy this thing in. Probably help to undo that a little bit. Yeah. There we go. That's the spring in. Now we can begin to raise the axle and get this bottom part of the shock absorber in. So the springs are in, the shocks are in. Now all it's left to do is to put the wheels back on and see how this thing looks. See how much lift we get. Alright, so here's the finished product. As you can see, it's definitely got some lift on it compared to where how it was before. Definitely looks like probably 2 inches front and rear. Yeah, almost even. Now I'm not going to measure it just yet because I haven't moved the vehicle since plopping it down, so the suspension might be holding it up a little bit. So I'm going to take it for a drive about 30 miles into town, come back, and then we can definitely measure it then, let the suspension have a chance to kind of settle down and set in and whatnot.
2 years later.
Alright, so even though I said I was going to go for a quick drive, it has now been 2 years since I installed this lift. Yeah, I know, quite a delay on that. But I got to tell you, this thing's still looking pretty good. And as you can see, I mean, it's taken me to some well, places I probably wouldn't take this thing if it wasn't lifted. I'm still showing about 2 inches of lift on the rear and on the front. Hasn't sagged a bit. And this thing drives beautifully. I haven't had any issues with any of the modifications that I made to this thing. within a week of installing this thing, I did have it aligned, and the shop noticed right away that there was definitely a difference. They were like, oh, what the heck, this thing's sitting a little bit higher. And then they saw, you know, the little pipe that I have in there and stuff like that, and you know, they did the alignment anyway. Hey, did you know that you have this installed on your vehicle? Yeah, I know I have that. I installed it myself. But the thing aligned, and the toe's perfect. They did say that the camber was going to be a little bit off, you know, just because, you know, the A-arms are sitting a little bit lower and they're off center a little bit. But they said it wasn't going to be enough to cause any abnormal tire wear or anything noticeable. And so far in the 2 years that I've been driving this thing, haven't noticed anything like that. I haven't noticed any weird noises, no squeaks, no jitters, no rattles, no shakes, no shimmies, anything like that. This thing drives wonderful. The only difference, besides, you know, the obvious lift, is a little bit stiffer suspension. So going around the corners or going over bumps, you know, stuff like that, yeah, you're gonna feel it. I have been loving it. It's been taking me to places that, I mean, normally I would take my Jeep, but hey, why am I gonna, you know, drive a Jeep that gets 12 miles of the gallon when I can drive this for, you know, 35, 40 miles of the gallon? It takes me to some cool places, you know? My little adventure mobile. So that's it. Lift's installed. 2-year update. It's been driving good. So if you got yourself a TDI Golf, or I don't know, this probably works on other Golfs as well, give it a shot if you want some more lift. That way you're not, you know, scraping the bottom of your belly pan and stuff like that. So that's all I got to say.